All right. Well, today on Pressing Matters, I'd like to welcome Hank Williams, legendary mastering engineer from Nashville, Tennessee. And today we're going to talk to him about his personal history and a lot about disc cutting. So, Hank, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's go back to the beginning. Where are you from originally, and what was your experience with music like when you were a younger person?
I was born in Savannah, Georgia. I've probably moved at least 18 times in my life. So I don't consider myself as being from anywhere in particular.
Right.
We lived as long as 4 years and as short as 2 months in any one place. So we moved around quite a bit.
Was that a military background or was that something else?
You know, most of that was when my dad was working for a different number of railway systems.
Oh, okay.
And so they worked sort of like, back in the 50s and 60s, I mean, the way you advanced was you took someone else's job in another city. You
right.
worked up the ladder that way. So
right.
we got moved around a lot. And in a lot of the places, because it was railway system, we were also mixed in with military people who were doing the same thing. So it seemed normal. So I have not been harmed in any way by my railroad life that I experienced as a child. So, yeah.
Now, when did music first come into your life? What were your first earliest memories of music?
Well, it's really funny that you asked that because I just last week have gone through pulling out all of my parents' vinyl records out of their bookcase. And I can remember being 5 years old and my dad had just bought a Zenith stereo system, which had huge cabinets, and they were separated like by 8 feet between the two. And one held the amplifier and the turntable and a speaker, and the other held, another speaker. And he and I would lay on the floor, and he would play music, and he'd actually point things out to me.
Okay.
This is an oboe. This is, this is a guitar. This is a harmonica. This is, and so, him, and then my parents, because we moved around, but as we moved around, probably one of the first things they always looked for when we moved to a new city was a church.
Right.
So music and church, it just kind of went together. And then as I got older, I started getting interested in electronics. And though I lived in a small city and didn't have a mentor, I spent a lot of time with basically an electronic chemistry set.
Right.
It was called 101 Electrical Experiments. I can't remember who put it out.
I've had one of those too. Yeah, where you do all sorts. You hook up all little different components, and you learn to build little circuits one at a time.
Yeah. And then when I was in high school, I bought a night kit and built my own 5-band shortwave receiver and climbed a tall pine tree in the backyard and hung a copper wire between my bedroom and top of this tree and listened to shortwave operators all over the world. And so, it's just kind of always been there.
Now, when did you transition into working in studios, and when did you get the inkling that a profession in audio was something that you'd be interested in?
Well, my first 3 years in college, I was a music major. And my third year, I realized that this probably wasn't going to work out for me.
Right.
And at that same time, I ran into a gentleman that was asking me questions about my college experience. And he was from Nashville, and he said, there's this college in Nashville that's starting this new music business program. maybe you should look into it.
Okay.
And I told my parents that I was going to transfer to Belmont University in Nashville, and had the pleasure and wonderful experience of being in the first multi-person graduating class out of that program. There was one guy one person that graduated the year before. So I was there at the beginning when this type of program was brand new.
Wow.
I don't know if maybe Berkeley was doing their music thing then, but I'm not sure that there was any other program like it in the United States in 1974 when I transferred in. So it took me 2 years because I switched majors, you had to catch up on some stuff. And so I graduated in 76 out of that program. I think there were 13 of us that graduated. And it was a fantastic experience because most of our professors, except for one, were all people who were in the Nashville industry.
Right.
So you took publishing from someone who owned a publishing company. You took marketing from the marketing guy at CBS Records. You took engineering and studio courses from people from Woodland Sound and CBS. And I mean, you know, we had dinner every semester with Francis Preston, president of BMI, and Wesley Rose from Acuff Rose Publishing.
Oh, wow. Right.
I mean, it was just, we were lucky.
Well, give us a sense of what Nashville, Nashville, everybody knows it as the boomtown that it is now. Tell us what Nashville was like in 1974.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question. Being in the music business, being in the music business was not looked upon as something that was desirable
right.
in Nashville in that time period.
Right.
I can remember I went to get car insurance, and this gentleman I'm sitting with who can't pronounce a hard R to save his life,
right.
Very Southern accent. Right. And he says, "Now, tell me what you do." And I said, "Well, I work at a recording studio, and I work with musicians, and I'm part of the record-making process." He says, "Now, do you socialize with those people?" And I'm like, it's like, "Sir, it's a job, and, I do my job, and then I go home at night, and, well, do you travel with those people?" Those people.
Right.
Those people.
Right.
They're infamous songwriters, people who were songwriting in the 60s on into the 70s and stuff. They couldn't get telephones.
Right.
AT&T, they, wouldn't give them a phone. And it was hard to get rent, especially for songwriters at that point in time. And so there were parts of Nashville that really looked down on the industry, and there's some justifiable reasons for that, but we were not part of today's entertainment industry back in the 70s. Right. So,
and you have witnessed a lot of changes from that time period to now. So when you get out of school in 1976, what's up with Hank in 1976?
Well, Hank has graduated. He has copped a summer job out at Opryland.
Okay.
And they used to have a convention called the Radio DJ Convention in Nashville. It's called something else now.
Right.
And there were some DJs there from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And they were hanging out at CBS Studios, and they were talking to some of the engineers there. And they said, we've lost our engineer at our local studio there in Calgary. Do you know of anybody that we could talk to, maybe hire. And they said, well, go find this kid, Hank Williams. Here's the number. So, I talked to this gentleman, Peter Bentley. He was a Dutch guy, really, really nice gentleman. And I initially took the job as an intern through Belmont. And so I accepted this internship at Soundwest Studios in Calgary, Alberta. Then I went to the bookstore and bought a map to find out where it was.
This is pre-internet, obviously, right?
Having traveled all my life and watched my dad do this,
right?
You accept a job, and moving was like not a problem for me. So I went to Calgary, and it eventually turned into a job. It was fairly short-lived. It was only about 8 months total. Being in Nashville and being around the industry and having opportunities and access to visit studios and sometimes hang out, I got to work and do a lot of the wiring prep for Soundstage when it became Soundstage.
Okay.
When I was still in school. So, being naive, I thought that every studio experience would be like the studio experience in Nashville.
Right.
And I got there to Calgary, and I loved Canadians. Calgary was a beautiful city. Every night when I went home, I looked at the Canadian Rockies out on the horizon.
Right.
It was wonderful, but it was not a music center. It was not a recording center.
Right.
And while I could spend a couple of weeks with a bunch of unbelievable musicians from Ireland, experiencing all sorts of instruments I'd never seen before, but I fell in love with, and they were wonderful people. But then to spend, 10 days doing voiceovers on the Alberta tar sands and transferring them to 16 millimeter mag stock was just not what I wanted to do.
Right.
So Warren Peterson, who was the chief engineer at Soundstage in the beginning, called me one day and said, I need some help down here. Would you be interested in coming back to Nashville? And I said, yes. So I went back to Nashville.
So that was about 1977. You went back to Nashville then?
Yep. Yeah.
And what kind of work were you doing when you first went back to Nashville?
I was basically a second engineer there at Soundstage, and that lasted about 90 days. One of a gentleman named Mike Porter, who we transferred into Belmont at the same time. He came in from Auburn. I came in from Sanford in Birmingham in 1974, and we were fast friends. And he called me one day and said, "We've lost someone here at Woodland. Would you like to come to work at Woodland?" And I went over and interviewed and turned in my notice at Soundstage and went to work at Woodland.
Now, you said in some previous correspondence we had, you said Woodland is that where you started disc cutting? Was that your first experiences with working with mastering?
Yeah, that's my first experience with working with mastering. I was replacing someone that had kind of done both. And at Woodland, I started out in assisting in the studios. Woodland's studios were not as far along in technology or control rooms. Their studio control rooms were not as far along in technology and acoustics as either Soundwest in Calgary or Soundstage in Nashville by any means to me. And I found them in my young whippersnapper attitude kind of underwhelming.
Right.
And I'm saying I was, there was arrogance there, it's
right.
Like, this is a really step down. Now, mastering was a totally different thing.
Right.
there. And there was just it was just a much finer application of audio with a lot more nuance.
Right.
And things were, there were ITI equalizers and this two wonderful, cutting systems that just reeked of German technology, and also, monitoring system, especially in one room. The client room was a Westlake room, which was, hot stuff in 1977.
Right.
Hidley's work in the Westlake stuff. So, and so I'd been hired to replace this guy. I'd kind of done both, and there came a time where Glenn Snoddy, the manager of Woodland, came to me and said, "You don't seem to be spending any time in the studios. Do you not want to do that?" And I said, "No, I want to do mastering."
Okay.
So he let me switch. I just didn't want to do the studio gig there at Woodland.
Right.
And so spring of 1977, I probably cut my first record.
Wow. Now, let's for people who may not be as familiar with the intricacies of how a record is made, let's talk about mastering, and let's talk about mastering through the prism of time. The job has changed over the decades, but what's the basic idea when somebody's reading the liner notes on a record and they see this mastering? What does that mean?
Now or then?
I guess in the general sense, and then how it's transitioned from the vinyl world to digital.
Well, I think in the general sense, you're the last person that has the opportunity to change or correct anything in the sonic character of the music. You're also oftentimes responsible for preparing it for a particular format. Mm-hmm. Be it radio or audio file playback, or in this day and time, data reduced types of formats that you have to deal with. And also back in the vinyl days, you were very much responsible for the transition from the creative to the manufacturing.
Right, to the industrial part of it.
It was really there was a manufacturing process. Mm-hmm. And even in the final creation of the master in the vinyl days, that was an electromechanical process. It's not a data process. It's not a file. It's a very flat piece of aluminum that has a coating on it. It's a lot like fingernail polish that the groove is actually cut into. And then it goes off to a plating shop where metal parts of that are made. And then it goes to manufacturing. Those parts are put on presses. A soft squish puck of vinyl is put in the middle of the press, and the press presses the puck, and the puck expands out to the outer edges, and there you have a gross representation of the record.
Emphasis on gross, right?
Well, it's still not finished. There's still things that have to be done, and there are, and were even back then, wonderful manufacturing places and plating shops. And then there were other facilities that either their clientele couldn't pay for that kind of service, or, the labels back in those days, they owned their own manufacturing facilities.
Right.
And labels were all about time and money.
Yes.
So there was a point at which they wouldn't try any harder.
Right. So
Yeah.
in the 70s, when you're mastering for the vinyl format, they give you a tape. And now, is that tape just the final mixes? Have they been sweetened at all? Or do you have to edit and splice the tapes together? Or are they pretty much good to go when they land on your desk?
Well, in the mid 70s, you would more often than not receive an edited and assembled album.
Okay.
No sweetening.
Okay.
But as time went on and people started making multiple versions of their mixes on analog tape, then you would just get, I mean, you know, in the early 90s, I mean, sometimes I'd get 55 rolls of tape.
Wow.
on a half-inch tape on an album.
Wow.
Just, you know, run down my wall. So you would basically be assembling albums at that point in time.
Okay.
But in the early vinyl days, you basically had an album that was put together. If it was 15 IPS, it fit on one 10.5-inch reel. If it was run at 30, you had an A side and a B side.
B-side, right.
And you previewed the album and, you know, made notations on, I mean, some people put some sort of sheet or card.
Right.
Of EQ and compression and level changes. And after you did that, you would cut a reference. Mm-hmm. A reference disc that was 12 inch
yes.
that you could send to the producer and the record company for them to listen to and improve or come back with comments that needed to be changed.
Now, there's a very funny memo that I have in one of my manuals for my lathe, and it's from Neumann, and it talks about how the disc cutting engineer is essentially a liar. Their job is to convince that producer and the people listening to the reference acetates that what they're hearing is exactly what came off of the tapes. But we know behind the scenes that you're making some changes, and you alluded to a few of those changes, like some EQ and compression work. Tell people a little bit too about, because of the vinyl resurgence and so many people now putting their music on vinyl, tell people a little bit about what the limitations of the format are, especially in stereo, and what oftentimes a disc cutting engineer has to do to make sure that it performs well on the vinyl format.
Well, it really is a sleight of hand. I mean, it is, and I'm smiling right now thinking about it. It really is not what you gave me.
Right.
You know, it really isn't. And there's some laws of physics at play there in the cutting of a disc that limit what can be done.
Right.
And some of those things, and I'm not going to get into RIAA curves and stuff like that,
right.
but bottom end really affects what you can and can't do with your cutting, and that can be solved with elliptical equalizers, which blend the bottom end together and make it not as stereo as it might be.
Right. Stereo
causes the groove depth to vary both deeper and shallower.
Yes.
And if it goes too far, then there's no groove for the playback stylist to actually track. So the record skips.
Right.
I think it may be Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life might be known as like the record with the most skips.
Oh, really?
I can't remember. It was one of Stevie Wonder's. I think it was done by Kendon, mastered by Kendon.
And now I'm going to have to pull my copy and put it under a microscope and take a look at it, because now I'm very curious.
Check it out.
Yeah.
And then sibilance is something we have to take into account when cutting. And high frequency information, because of rotational speed, the outside of the disc is basically running faster diameter-wise than the inside.
Right.
So your outside edge is normally where they would want to put the single. Yes. Both to sell you on that single and because it could be the loudest cut. Right. And the inside place, inside cut is like the toughest place to represent high frequency and stuff like that. Yes. In Nashville, we always had I always wanted to shoot my gospel or contemporary Christian clients, because they always put the big finale with all the strings and the 4 key changes
and choruses, right? Yeah.
on the inner groove, and you're like, what can you do?
Right,
so,
right.
And I want to say this: one of the most gratifying parts of disc cutting in the 70s and 80s was, I'd have to say that 26% of my job was education of my clients, and
right.
It was really fulfilling. It was so fulfilling to see the lights turn on in their brains and their eyes and stuff like that.
Right.
It was really a great part of the job that I feel like got lost in the transition into digital.
Right. So what systems, you said German, so were you using Neumann cutting systems there, or what was your cutting systems like there at your first cutting job?
At Woodland, we had one system that was a VMS 70 with an SAL, stock SAL rack.
Yeah.
And a 272, that was in the client room, the Westlake room. And then in the other room was a VG66.
Okay, yeah.
Which, and I can't remember, I don't know what model the lathe was. It was not a VMS 70. It was something before that.
Right.
I mean, it looks really similar.
Yes.
It just wasn't that cool gray.
Yeah, they had that kind of military green color in the 60s,
yeah,
and then they moved over to the tan gray.
And then the console in there was a for some reason, it sticks in my mind that it was made by a place called Martin Audio.
Okay.
It was a vertical rack, but it had PEVs and EEs and all that sort of stuff in it.
Right.
But it was all discrete wired.
Right.
It was all hand to hand, relays and all that sort of stuff. And interestingly enough, we did a couple of direct-to-discs there at Woodland, and we did another record that was like the first direct-to-two-track digital.
Yeah.
There was a Farrell Morris, who was a percussionist, record there, and even later Ronnie Millsap got hit to this, but in those records, those direct-to-disc and stuff, we would simultaneously cut on both systems, the SAL system and the older VG66 system.
Yeah.
And the VG66 system always won.
Really?
Yeah. And later, there were a couple of records that with Ronnie Millsap, the album was set up in EQ in the client room, but tie lines were run over to the VG66 system, and those albums were actually cut on with the VG66 amplifiers and their HK66 high frequency limiters, which I thought were like beautiful.
That's interesting because people these days don't want to touch the VG66 amplifiers. There's a bunch of them for sale currently, and
I'd give my left arm for a VG66. I'm telling you.
Yeah. People.
Yeah.
I guess, did they go to transformerless later in the 70s? And isn't that one of the things that happened? I think that's what somebody told me, as they changed the kind of internal structure of the amps on those things later on.
Yeah, Master Mix. When Master Mix started, we had the transformerless. I think it's designated as the SAL74B.
Yeah.
So we had the transformerless system and direct drive techniques and drive unit and Zuma system. Pitch control. And I mean, I don't think in a Neumann system you could build anything better than what we built in 1983 there at Master. So,
well, let's talk about that transition. So you worked at Woodland for how long did you work there?
I worked there for about 6 years. I worked from 77 to 83.
Okay. So what happened in 1983 then?
there was a producer in town that the industry used to have these pro-am golf tournaments, and it would be, a couple of non-music people paired up with people in the industry.
Okay.
One of those tournaments was put on by a huge talent agency in Tulsa, Oklahoma called the Halsey Agency.
Okay.
And so a Nashville producer and guys from Oklahoma decided they wanted to be in the business.
Okay.
And so this producer had an engineer who had worked at Woodland, who I knew. They decided that Nashville needed a mix room, mastering room facility.
Okay.
Thus the name Master Mix.
Okay.
It was a mix. There was a mix room and a mastering room.
Okay.
And so I had known this engineer from college, from Belmont, and he asked me if I was interested in leaving Woodland and coming into this new venture.
Okay.
And so that's how that transition took place.
Now, was that a novel concept in the early 1980s, a dedicated mixing and mastering facility, or was that something was there a trend towards that already, or was that something that was new?
There was no trend. No.
Yeah.
No, that was kind of a new. Yeah, that was a new deal.
Yeah.
So.
And did they have a disc cutting system there?
No, we had to. We started from scratch and had to find the system. We found the system in the winter of '82 at a place called Discworks in Schaumburg, Illinois.
Wow.
And a gentleman named Michael Freeman was, I don't know if he owned it or was in charge of it at that point in time. I think it was actually started by my good friend, Gary Hedden. I think Gary Hedden actually bought that system at Discworks in the beginning. So we found it. We brought it to Nashville and purchased the B conversion for the SAL rack, the techniques, the Zuma, all that sort of stuff. And I had access to a technical person who could do all that work for us. At the same time, it's really funny in this day and time, people are always looking for color and news over these different transformers and stuff like that. Well, back in the 80s, we were trying to get rid of all that stuff.
Right.
So we put a lot of effort into what we were doing.
What were some of the significant projects that can you remember anything significant that you cut on that system?
That's a word that kind of is loaded.
Anything stand out in your memory as something that went through, anything in particular that you remember cutting in that room?
Most of it was CCM and country stuff at that point in time. I think KT Oslin's first album was real transitional for Nashville.
Right.
A lot of the Warner Brothers stuff, like Eddie Rabbitt and stuff like that, was transitional.
Right.
To some of those. We worked for, all the labels. It's you look back at the charts, it's all there. Michael W. Smith in the CCM world was a huge artist, and we were in that transition from what you would call Southern gospel to contemporary Christian, and we did a lot of that work. In fact, to put it in perspective, it was so much. I remember one time an A&R person from one of the Nashville labels sitting me down, and we did a lot of work for them. Well, we did a lot of work for them, and she was telling me she was informing me of how important, how blessed I was that I had their business.
Right.
And this was a country label, and I didn't have the guts to tell her that, unbeknownst to her, I had 2 CCM companies that were each 5 times more in income to master mix than her country label was.
Wow, that's amazing.
But getting back to your original question, Alan Jackson was a huge breakthrough.
Yes.
Brooks and Dunn, all that new country kind of stuff. I mean, the Arista label, we did a lot of work for Arista's country division.
Right.
Atlantic's, when they came into Nashville for country stuff, we did a lot of that also. So,
right. Now, when did you first become aware of digital starting, and where for you was kind of the point where people started asking you to master things for CD release? What in your memory is kind of an era when that happened?
Well, that day happened when someone from Word Records, which was a huge, I'll call it a gospel record label, but
okay.
I mean, they had CCM genres, they had black gospel genres, they had Southern gospel. I mean, they had divisions,
Right.
It was a huge, when someone from that label walked in and sat down in my mastering room and said, if you want to keep our business, you're going to have to equip yourself to go to CD format.
Okay.
That pretty much, at that point in time, my buddy who had asked me to come to work at Woodland, Mike Porter, was then representing Sony Digital Equipment. And so we ordered our first 1630 system with a DAE 1100 and went into the CD business. Yeah.
Now, at that time, then, would you create separate masters for the digital release and the vinyl release, or is that something that kind of an idea that came later?
Our digital releases were mirrors of what we set up for our analog.
Okay.
Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I know these days there's a huge there's people that market themselves specifically as I master for vinyl in the digital realm, and I always tell people if you follow the general basic guidelines of good mixing and mastering, you're usually about 90% of the way to a vinyl master, and to leave that last 10% up to the cutting engineer who knows the format. So I was wondering if that's kind of a new phenomenon here in the 2000s, or were there discussions like that back in the 1980s and early 1990s?
Well, I can only say from my own personal experience. I mean, I think Nashville gave up on vinyl really quickly.
Yeah.
I know the CCM industry did.
Right. Country
hung on to the vinyl format a lot longer than the CCM people did. So there came a time where we just didn't consider vinyl.
Really?
And it probably happened earlier than you might think.
Well, I have some friends, that own record stores, and I had a discussion with him about, finding, vinyl country albums, say from 1985 on. And he said they have a collectability factor because there wasn't that many vinyl albums made in the country realm after the mid 1980s. And he also said people listened to a lot of cassettes at that time too. So was there any special mastering considerations for cassette at that time, or was that just a mirror of the other masters that you were creating?
It was a mirror. I mean, you have to remember there was an economic factor in there for the labels. I mean, and I was doing this, high res stuff, and labels were like, we don't want to hear about it.
Right.
Does it take more time? Well, it takes. We don't want to hear about it.
Right.
We're not interested. And it was brutal for me to work all day at 88.2 24-bit and just have this glorious master. It was, for me, heartbreaking to have to do that to my source to get it to the 1630 for CD replication.
Right.
Oh, well, one thing, getting back to the cassettes and the transition in the country market, singles lasted a lot longer for country than the albums did. So that's why we had to keep the the lathes around was because of the singles, the jukebox market.
Right.
And oddly, about cassettes, one of the things we used to fight as disc cutters in the earlier days was producers would get these cassettes from the studios and they'd be listening to those. And of course, cassettes have self-erasure.
Right.
It happens every time you play it.
Right.
Up to a point. And they would get what I call it cassette envy. I mean, they would get their reference from us, our 12-inch reference when we mastered the album.
Right.
And go, this doesn't sound like my cassette. And we're like, yeah, right. It doesn't. It sounds like your master. And they're like, well, so there were times where we were actually forced to preview the cassette and compare our disc cutting settings and make our disc cutting sound like that cassette.
Really? So you're degrading your master for another format.
Yeah, I'm not saying it happened a lot, but I mean, this is how clients can be caught up in what they're listening to, and then when you hand them your final, whether it was a CD when CDs started coming out or whatever, I mean, it could really throw them for a loop.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's this whole educational learning and psychological help.
Right.
That mastering had to provide, as well as the technical experience.
Well, we've seen that even in the last 12 years. 12 years ago, people were still, getting back into this resurgence of the vinyl thing. And there was this whole educational process about all the things that you've talked about intergroove distortion. And it blows people's mind for them to even wrap their head around the fact that this groove is moving at a higher velocity on the outside of the record than the inside of the record, or that your playback stylus is not just going back and forth, it's going up and down and back and forth at the same time. And, it took me a couple of years just doing it to even wrap my head around it. So I think that educational part that you talk about is so important. And we've seen the curve. We educate less people now because we get more and more, return clients now, and they've already been through the process. And one of the things they always say is they say, oh, well, I got my test pressing and it doesn't sound like my digital masters. And we try and say, well, try and evaluate it as a record, as an album. How does it sound the way that you want it to sound as an album? Because sometimes I tell people it's the limitations of vinyl that are some of the things that people like about it when they call it warm and they call it all those things. Yeah, it's like, exactly. I didn't want to blow up my cutter head cutting your music, so there's a little less trouble on this,
Yeah.
So, those kind of things.
And explain spring back to them and the high frequency part of the groove structure and heat in the plating tank and how that affects the... it's that lacquer that you cut is basically soft. It's viscous.
Yes.
It's literally viscous.
Right.
And it wants to go back to where it was. It wants to spring back to its earlier form. It doesn't like being shaped by that cutting tool.
Right.
It's rebelling the whole time.
Rebelling is a great word. Yes. It wants to go back to its natural state.
Yep. Yeah.
Now, a topic that's hot, in audiophile communities and stuff like that is this whole notion of cutting from digital versus cutting from original master tapes. Do you have an opinion? Do you weigh in on that? I feel that, any way that you cut a record is valid, especially if you're working from high sample rates. But do you have any feelings on that?
The only thing I would say is that if they get a tape from I'm going to say two things. One is I never did a lot of reissue kind of stuff because when I was cutting, the record labels had their own libraries in New Jersey and California. And, so Polygram, if they wanted to reissue something, they did it themselves.
Right.
And stuff like that. But if you got a master from a library, if a label would actually send you one, I can guarantee you that tape does not sound like it did in 1961,
right,
when that tape was made. In the production schedule of an album, they would mix the single first, and they'd send it to mastering, and so we'd cut the single.
Okay.
They wouldn't need anything, and it would take 13 weeks for the single to get to where it was going to go in the charts, be it number 1 or number 12 or whatever.
Right.
So there was 13 weeks for them to continue working on the album.
Okay.
Before they would call for the album. When I would put that tape back on with the single and the rest of the songs and play that single, I could tell it had changed.
Yeah?
Yep.
Wow.
So thinking of pulling a 40-year-old master up and thinking that you're going to be cutting exactly what Doug Sax or Bernie Grundman did back in 1967 is not valid. It's not.
Right.
It's just not. Yeah.
Now, a question I like to ask mastering engineers, because it relates to this topic too, is that as a mastering engineer, and I know you said you didn't really do a lot of reissue type work, but if you were working on a reissue, is there like a standard school of thought that says, I need to preserve this as it was recorded, say in 1965, or if you have tools available to make it a quote unquote better experience for the listener, is that something that a mastering engineer is given the opportunity to do, and is that a good idea? I think in terms of like those mobile fidelity reissues where they cut them and they say, we do no changes to this because it would not represent the music in a correct way. Now, is that a school of thought that you adhere to, or do you feel that using modern tools on older masters is a valid way to present music to the listener?
Well, people who say, I'm not going to do any EQ, I'm not going to do any... The transition from mastering being a pressing plant, one-to-one transfer by men in white coats to people with tools that made music transition better to radio and to the consumer, that happened in the mid-'60s.
Right.
So if you're redoing Rumors and you say, I'm just going to put this on and cut it flat because that does just, well, they probably didn't do it flat.
Right.
I mean, does the tape include Steve Hall's EQ card?
Right.
Does it include Doug's EQ card, his sheet?
Right.
I mean, and plus the other thing is we all had changes in our system. So even though we wrote stuff down, your system isn't going to sound the same. You ain't going to do the same way.
Right.
So I really think that you need to serve your client's needs. And that's something that people maybe don't understand sometimes about mastering. We serve two masters.
Right.
We serve the artist and we serve the record company.
Right. And those two sometimes can be wildly far apart.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, our RCA back in the vinyl days, I mean, they had somewhere in their system, somewhere in their RCA world, probably in Indianapolis somewhere, they had a guy who sat there and took the test pressing and put it on a third octave, looked at a third octave analyzer, and they had grease markings over there where an LED couldn't go above that white line. And
really?
You get this phone call, and the guy said, you've got too much 500 on this record.
Right.
And I'm like, well, you know what? It was approved that way.
Right.
So you call Tom Collins and tell him that he's got too much 500 on his record, and that he'll call me if he wants to change
it. Right.
And I never got called.
Right. Now, do you think they were doing that? Were they looking for playability? Like I've read, I've read like
I
back,
think so.
back in the old days, like they would not even consider, like when all music was recorded direct to disc, the engineers often would select the take that they wanted by looking at it under the microscope rather than actually listening to the music to see which one they thought would play better. So that there's some considerations there.
Yeah.
Now,
I think they didn't want any albums coming back.
Sure. Yeah. No. Yeah. You get one that gets out in the wild with a skip on it, and that's money out of somebody's pocket for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, are you still mastering today?
No. I am long gone. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, what were you surprised in the last decade or so at the resurgence of the vinyl format, or does it make sense to you on any level, or is it something that you just kind of shake your head and say, I don't know why that came back?
Yeah, I really don't know why it came back.
Right.
I think that a lot of it has to do with, oddly enough, I think that there was a time where young people wanted something that their parents didn't listen to.
Right.
And so it was cool. They had vinyl. Their mom and dad didn't. They had CD.
Right.
Yeah, you have to tell me where that came from, Clint. You really do.
I just think it's more fun. I mean, I like the artwork. I like the liner notes, all of those. I mean, I first saw your name on probably an Alan Jackson album when I was younger, and I was starting to analyze liner notes and trying to learn what those jobs meant. What is a mixing engineer? What's a mastering engineer? So like you talk about educating people about the vinyl format, those records to me were an education also, because you start seeing the same names over and over again, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe I should pay attention to this. And this is before Discogs, when you can just type somebody's name in and all of their credits pop up. You start noticing oh, this person worked on all of these particular records, and this person worked on that. So it's back to that educational component, I think, too, also. And, there's definitely a nostalgia factor, and, something that's big these days is the whole colored vinyl and handmade variant vinyl and stuff like that. And that wasn't, back when you were working with vinyl, it was mostly black vinyl records. And because it was a commodity more than a collectible, I guess, at that point.
My last vinyl record that I mastered was a Roy Rogers picture disc.
Really?
Yep.
Nice.
Speaking of, those kind of things. Yeah, it was an album for RCA where artists did Roy Rogers tunes. That kind of record. It was a picture disc.
When do you remember what year that was?
I don't remember. You can look it up on All Music.
Yeah.
You'll find it. But we sold our lathe, I think, in 2002.
Okay. All right. Well, they were just a few years before before the whole thing started up again.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even want to know what they sold it for, because I would probably faint.
Oh, you'd faint. You'd faint, because it was 2 mastering consoles and the lathe and a cutting system.
Oh, and that Technics motor alone. Yeah.
Technics motor. Yeah.
Like you said,
Chris, yeah.
At the time, that's about as good as it got, for sure.
Yeah. That's when we sold the lathe.
And actually, that's kind of late. I mean, I guess generally people have told me that, commercial vinyl, as far as major labels, early 1990s. Does that seem correct with you? That like somewhere around 91, 92 is when commercial record labels kind of gave up on vinyl for good?
Well, there again, I'd have to say that the country market was still doing singles.
Yeah.
We shut down our mix room and went strictly to mastering. And I think it was around 92 that we turned our mix room into a mastering room also.
Really? Okay.
And we did not put a lathe in that room.
Okay.
But the system in the original mastering room continued to do work for country labels, particularly in 10-inch.
Interesting. Yeah. 10-inch records.
I mean 7-inch.
7-inch. Okay.
10-inch lacquers.
That makes a lot of sense on the jukebox thing, for sure.
Yeah.
I've found a lot of kind of mid-90s singles out there. So that's
See, that was still a huge format for them. And like I said, the CCM industry is long gone on vinyl by then.
Right.
I mean, they didn't want anything to do with it.
Right.
It was all CD. Yeah.
Wow. Well, Hank, we got over an hour of material here, and this is great. I appreciate you sitting down and taking the time to talk with me, and learning about your history is amazing. I hope it inspires other people, and I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
Oh, man, it was a blast. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for the opportunity.